The moment my brother accused me of stealing our grandmother's legacy, I realized the truth wasn't going to defend itself. That line stayed with me, sharper than any legal document, heavier than any signature I'd later prove authentic. It marked the beginning of a quiet war inside our family. A war fought not with raised voices or dramatic confrontations, but with paper, procedure, and the unbearable weight of responsibility. When my grandmother passed, she left behind more than a will. She left behind order, a structure she had trusted us to honor. But grief can twist even the gentlest intentions, and doubt crept into corners I once believed were unbreakable. One missing document, one suspicious copy, one signature questioned, and suddenly everything she built began to wobble. I didn't seek a battle. I didn't want one. But when the truth is fragile, someone has to steady it. The story you're about to hear isn't loud. It doesn't rely on dramatic outbursts or shocking betrayals. Instead, it unfolds in the quiet places, courtrooms humming with fluorescent lights, early mornings spent sorting through dust-covered letters, nights when a single email carried more weight than 1,000 spoken words. It's a story about family, yes, but it's also about what happens when one person chooses accuracy over convenience, integrity over ease, and clarity over the kind of silence that lets falsehoods grow. If you've ever carried a burden you didn't ask for, if you've ever had to protect someone's truth because no one else would, then you'll understand the steps I took, one by one, to keep her legacy intact. Stay with me. And if you want more stories like this, quiet, true, and deeply human, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The envelope arrived just after noon, slipped beneath the edge of my welcome mat the way official things often arrive, quietly, as if they already know their authority will speak for them. I set it on the kitchen table, letting the paper acclimate to the room's dry air, while I silenced my phone and nudged the ceiling fan to its lowest setting. Then I used the side of a paring knife to open the seam in one clean line. The heading confronted me first: Petition to invalidate will. The typeface was sharp, government-issued, uncompromising. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and last night's tea, a domestic calm that did nothing to soften what I was reading. I steadied my breath, aware of the strange weight of a moment that begins quietly, but will not stay that way for long. His name appeared in the first paragraph, my brother's, in bold, as the petitioner. The accusation was stated without tremor. Forged signature, improperly witnessed, procedural defects. I picked up a pencil and drew 3 small check marks in the margin. Handwriting sample, seal identification, archival source. My handwriting looked steadier than my pulse felt. A thin band of afternoon light stretched across the table, stopping just before the envelope, as if the house itself hesitated to touch it. The refrigerator hummed behind me, regular and indifferent. A reminder that life continues even when someone decides to challenge the last thing our grandmother signed with her own steady hand. I called him before I let emotion build into shape. His voice came through immediately, too quick, as if he'd been waiting for the phone to ring. "It's just the law," he said. Like that excused the absence of conversation. Like it made the petition a thing detached from our family, our history. I stood at the window, watching a neighbor's dog cross the cul-de-sac with slow certainty. "The law still needs the truth," I said, and my voice surprised me with how evenly it landed. He didn't respond right away. A car passed, its tires whispering on the dry asphalt. He exhaled, short and defensive, then ended the call. The line clicked back to silence, too clean, too final for what was beginning. I set the phone down and let the quiet rebuild itself around me. Arguing would only blur the edges, data would keep them sharp. Facts first, noise later. I turned the petition over, scanning for inconsistencies, noting dates and certification numbers. My grandmother used to say truth has a posture, upright, deliberate, never hunched. I thought of her handwriting, its small loops, the calm weight of her signature. A knot formed low in my chest, not of anger but of something cooler, clearer. Resolve. I would follow the record, not the volume of anyone's voice. The air through the screen door was cool, carrying the faint scent of dry soil and fallen leaves. Everything around me felt orderly. The challenge itself was the only thing that wasn't. A soft rustle drew me back to the table. The petition's pages had begun to curl slightly at the corners from the shift in humidity. I flattened them gently, noticing the texture of the paper, thicker than standard, slightly chalky, the kind favored by courts. The ceiling fan clicked once, a tiny mechanical hiccup in the relaxed afternoon rhythm. The house held its breath with me. The sound of my own reading, slow, controlled, precise, became a metronome steadying my thoughts. I could smell the faint trace of old envelopes lingering from the drawer where I kept spare stamps. Small mundane details that grounded me in the moment, reminding me the world was still intact, even if my brother had chosen to fracture his part of it. The last page slid forward as I adjusted the stack, revealing the corner of my grandmother's folder beneath it. The tan cardstock, the neatly pressed edge she always smoothed with her thumb. The porch light outside flicked on earlier than usual, its glow reaching across the floorboards and just brushing the folder's spine before stopping, as if marking a boundary it refused to cross. I watched the line of light hold steady there, quiet but insistent. Something about the stillness of that moment felt like the first sentence of a truth she had already written long ago. The hook tightened, not dramatic, just inevitable. Something had begun. Something I would see through. The next morning I sat across from my brother in the attorney's conference room, a space designed for neutrality, gray carpet, frosted glass, a bowl of untouched mints placed between us like a ceremonial offering neither of us wanted. He didn't waste time. The signature was copied, he said, folding his arms as though bracing for impact. I opened my notebook and wrote the sentence exactly as spoken, adding the time and date in the margin. His foot tapped under the table, a restless, uneven rhythm that betrayed more than his words did. The air smelled faintly of industrial cleaner, cold and efficient. I kept my breathing steady, allowing silence to settle wherever it wanted. Facts deserved space, and I was there to give them room. His attorney slid a printed scan toward me, grainy, low resolution, the kind of reproduction that hid more than it revealed. One corner of the page was clipped, and an entire witness line was missing. "This is the basis of your claim?" I asked, keeping my tone level. She cleared her throat and said the full record was being located. I placed the document back on the table without touching the clipped corner, then requested access to the original archive or whatever source had produced the scan. My brother looked away, jaw tight, as though the page itself had betrayed him. I documented the exchange line by line, the soft scratch of my pen the only fluent sound in the room. There was a brief stretch of tense air, the kind that makes time feel narrower. My brother leaned back, crossing his arms again. "You're blind to legal procedure," he said, as if that could shrink what I knew to be true. I didn't raise my voice. "I knew her," I answered. Not as a weapon but as a fact, simple and immovable. The attorney shifted in her seat, adjusting a file that didn't need adjusting. Outside the window, the courthouse flag moved once in a faint current of wind. The world continued its measured pace while we sat locked in a small, brittle standoff, two people aiming arguments at a silence that wasn't taking sides. Hearing him question her integrity cracked something quiet inside me. not with anger but with a tired ache. Our grandmother's name had always been steady ground, the one part of our lives never up for negotiation. To watch it now pulled into accusation felt like watching a landmark erased in real time. Still, I didn't let the ache decide anything. Emotion didn't belong in a record that needed to stay clean. I straightened the papers in front of me, aligning their edges until they formed a crisp line. The conference room lights hummed above us in a steady drone, indifferent to the fracture forming beneath them. I kept my voice steady, choosing precision over the tremor grief wanted to send. Before leaving, I took photographs of the intake paperwork and logged each one with a timestamp, 8:12 p.m. The digital confirmation blinked on my phone screen, then locked itself into storage with the confidence of something that would not shift. I stepped into the hallway, cooler and quieter than the conference room, and created a folder labeled simply, Estate Challenge. The act was methodical, grounding. I could smell old carpet fibers warmed by the building's heating system, a faint reminder of every courthouse I'd ever walked through. My pulse slowed into a manageable rhythm. Documentation wasn't dramatic. It was a kind of armor, one page at a time. When I left the building, the weight of the meeting stayed behind me like a shadow that refused to follow. I kept my pace even, letting the evening air settle my thoughts. The attorney's door clicked shut somewhere behind me, soft but enough to end the moment. I didn't feel triumphant or shaken, only steady. Sometimes calm itself unsettles people, and I'd watch the discomfort on their faces when I refused to rise to any bait. Outside, the parking lot lights hummed, casting clean lines across the pavement. I made a final note in my ledger. Extract records, request verification, schedule follow-up. Steps, nothing more. I remembered the afternoon she took me to the notary, a mild day, the kind that seemed to breathe easily. She held my arm not because she needed support, but because she liked the quiet companionship. The office smelled of ink and old air conditioning, a combination that felt both official and strangely comforting. She signed 3 copies, each stroke slow but deliberate. The notary watched closely, eyes tracing every movement of her pen. I stood beside her, observing the neat way she aligned the pages before handing them over. She pressed the seal with the same care she gave to the knitted blankets she made for us as kids. At the time, it felt procedural. Now, in hindsight, it feels almost prophetic. Her making sure her voice would not be drowned out by someone else's urgency or disappointment. Even then, she left nothing to chance. On the way home that day, she told me something I hadn't thought of in years. If anyone ever questions this, the partner office keeps a parallel confirmation. She said it lightly, like she was offering a household tip, but her eyes held a quiet foresight. I didn't understand the weight of it then. Now it felt like a breadcrumb she'd placed on a trail she suspected we might one day need to walk. Sitting in my kitchen, I opened the drawer where I kept old tax records and warranties, searching for the notary's receipt. My fingers brushed against a small, folded slip with fading ink. There it was, crisp enough to still matter, worn enough to show it had lived with us for a while. I held it up to the light, letting the numbers and date settle clearly into memory. I scanned through a stack of envelopes, each one holding some artifact of adult life. Bills, renewals, confirmations. Until my hand brushed the thin paper of the receipt she'd insisted on saving. The edges were frayed, softened by time, but the text remained legible. Notary fee, date, confirmation number. I placed it on the table, flattening the bend where it had once been folded. My laptop hummed to life as I compared the receipt's details to the petition's claims. The alignment was too precise, too consistent to be disputed by a grainy scan. It was the kind of quietly perfect record she always kept. I took a picture of the receipt, zooming in until the numbers sharpened in the certainty. Facts rarely made noise, but they carried their own kind of gravity.
As I held the receipt, a mix of gratitude and ache settled in my chest. She had always moved through life with a measured certainty, never dramatic, never careless. Watching her sign those documents, I didn't know I was witnessing the groundwork for the moment I now stood in. She had prepared for every angle, every potential challenge, not out of distrust, but out of respect for the process. I breathed out slowly, letting the memory of her calm the edges of the present. The afternoon light in my kitchen filtered through the sheer curtains, casting rectangular patches on the table, aligning perfectly with the papers spread before me. Her intentions felt close, not as comfort, but as structure, something to lean on without collapsing into it. I scanned the receipt, saving the file under a name that followed my new organizational rules. 2023 notary_receipt.pdf. The click of the save button felt like locking a small truth into place. I uploaded it to the digital folder, creating a clear trail of evidence that didn't depend on anyone's memory.
The laptop's fan gave a low hum as the file processed, merging the past into the present in a way that felt almost clinical. I sat back in my chair, letting the stillness of the room surround me. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled down the street before fading into distance. I reopened the document to double-check clarity, no blur, no ambiguity, solid. Then, I composed an email to the partner office she'd mentioned that long ago afternoon. I kept it concise: request for verification, reference numbers, attached receipt. The subject line read, request, parallel notarial confirmation, a phrase that felt both formal and strangely intimate, like speaking her language. I reread the message once, adjusting the tone to stay level, no pleading, no defensiveness. Just facts, presented plainly. As I pressed send, the room felt quieter than before, as if the air itself had steadied. I folded the physical receipt and placed it in a small tray on the counter, the same tray where she used to leave grocery lists. Her caution had become my backbone. The clerk's office was colder than I expected, the kind of institutional chill that made paperwork feel heavier in the hands. I approached the window, sliding forward the documents that proved my legal standing as an heir. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with glasses perched on the edge of her nose, took her time reviewing each page. Behind her, metal filing cabinets lined the walls like quiet sentinels. "This file is in deep storage," she said, not unkindly. "Just factual," I nodded, accepting the implication. It wouldn't surface without the proper steps. I could smell the faint trace of toner from a nearby printer, its warmth cutting through the cold air in small intermittent bursts. I stood still, patient, letting the process set its own rhythm. She slid a form toward me, along with a request for identification. "We'll need this completed before retrieval," she said, tapping the upper corner with a neatly trimmed fingernail.
I filled in each line carefully, ensuring the ink dried before I moved the page. The room buzzed with the low murmur of distant conversations, papers being shuffled, phones ringing with soft, clipped tones. When she photocopied my ID, the machine cast a brief pulse of light across the countertop, illuminating the grain of the laminate surface. I took a photo of the completed form, storing it in my growing archive. It felt almost meditative, the act of documenting each step. While she keyed information into her system, she asked without looking up, "You're the granddaughter?" Her tone held no judgment, just curiosity shaped by habit. "And the person she trusted," I said quietly, my voice steady but firm. She paused for half a second before nodding, returning her focus to the screen. A stack of numbered tickets sat between us, each one representing someone else's weight, someone else's story. The fluorescent lights above flickered once, then steadied themselves again. Time in these places often felt suspended, part bureaucracy, part quiet choreography. I adjusted my stance and waited for her to finish typing. She handed me a slip confirming the request and explained the timeline for pulling a document from storage. I listened carefully, noting each step without interruption. There was something grounding about respecting the process, about letting the rules be what guided the next move instead of anyone's frustration or impatience. My grandmother had taught me that order wasn't an obstacle. It was a safeguard. I felt that truth settle deeper as the clerk spoke. The air smelled faintly of old envelopes and the metallic tang of filing cabinets,
that had been opened and closed 1,000 times. Nothing here rushed, and that felt right. I stepped to the side to send a fax with the required attachments. The machine hummed to life, pulling each sheet through with a steady mechanical swallow. I watched the confirmation page slide out, warm and slightly curled at the edge. The timestamp read 10:41 a.m. I saved the photo to my phone and added a brief note. Request filed. Awaiting retrieval. The hallway outside the office carried the echo of footsteps, each one muffled by the building's heavy flooring. I let myself breathe in the quiet, as though the building itself understood the importance of keeping its corners calm. When the final sheet printed, the room fell into a brief stillness. The clerk capped her pen with a soft click, a sound that punctuated the moment more sharply than anything spoken. She handed me the receipt across the counter, her expression neutral but attentive. I tucked it into my folder and stepped back from the window, feeling the subtle shift of something moving forward. Not loudly, not triumphantly, but with quiet precision. Outside, sunlight filtered weakly through the tall courthouse windows, casting pale rectangles on the tiled floor. I walked toward them, letting the calm settle where it needed to. The email from my brother's attorney arrived just after dusk, its tone polished but unmistakably strategic. They proposed an early division of assets to expedite closure, accompanied by a set of conditions that leaned heavily in their favor. I read the document twice, each line revealing another quiet attempt to reshape the narrative before the evidence had fully surfaced. The kitchen light cast a steady glow across the table, illuminating the phrasing that avoided responsibility while implying urgency. I closed the laptop for a moment, letting the air settle around me. Outside, a single car passed down the street, its headlights sweeping across my window before fading into the muted evening. Negotiating now would mean stepping into a conversation they'd designed to benefit themselves. I wasn't entering it. I reopened the laptop and typed a reply that was short, even-toned, and firm. All communication would remain in writing, and no informal agreements would be entertained. I removed any trace of emotion, leaving only clarity and boundaries. The cursor blinked at the end of the final sentence, steady as a pulse. I sent the email and immediately saved the thread to my archive. The screen's cool light reflected off the stainless steel sink, giving the whole kitchen a slightly clinical feel. It suited the moment. Clean lines, clean decisions. Verbal shortcuts had no place here. Next, I opened the ledger I'd begun compiling at the start of this process. On the first page, I added a new entry. Proposed premature division, declined. Under it, I created 4 columns: time, evidence, source, impact. I filled each one with meticulous detail, letting the documentation speak louder than any frustration I wasn't going to indulge. The act of recording steadied me, grounding the situation in structure. The notebook paper felt cool under my fingertips, the ink drying in small, disciplined strokes. Outside, the porch boards creaked as the night air shifted. Even the small noises seemed to align with the cadence of careful preparation. I reminded myself why I was doing this. Not out of resentment, not to win anything, but to keep her name intact. My grandmother's memory wasn't something to be traded for ease or speed. The thought settled heavily, but calmly, in my chest, as if the clarity itself had weight. I took a breath, slow and deliberate, letting it anchor me. The house felt still, the kind of stillness that doesn't demand attention but supports it. There was comfort in that. I flipped back through earlier entries in the ledger, each one forming a chain that grew stronger with every verified detail. With methodical focus, I exported every document related to the email into PDFs, labeling them in consistent format: EL-01, EL-02, and so on. Each file slid into the folder with a quiet satisfaction, like pieces of a puzzle fitting into place. I captured screenshots of the conversation, ensuring none of the timestamps or header lines could be questioned later. My laptop whirred softly as it processed the files, its predictable hum a kind of working companion. The room was otherwise silent, except for the faint ticking of a clock on the opposite wall. Time moved, but not hurriedly. It simply kept pace with the record I was building.
I gathered the documents into a physical stack as well, securing them with a single paperclip that snapped into place with a crisp sound. The stack felt balanced in my hands, not bulky, not flimsy, but quietly substantial. I set it beside the ledger, aligning the edges before closing the cover. There was nothing dramatic about the moment, only a shift, a sense that the ground beneath the case had firmed just a little more. The evening air drifted through the open kitchen window, carrying the faint scent of dry leaves. I clicked off the overhead light, letting the softer glow from the living room guide me forward. By 8:47 p.m., the house had settled into its evening quiet, the kind that sharpened focus rather than softened it. I laid out the documents in the clean row on the dining table and photographed the notary's seal from 3 angles, ensuring clarity of texture and embossment. At 9:03 p.m., I added the receipt, aligning the camera to catch the date and numeric code without glare. By 9:20 p.m., I had digitized the handwritten note my grandmother left tucked inside the older binder, her loops steady, her final instructions unambiguous. I cataloged each file with consistent naming conventions, letting them fall into an order that would speak for itself. The glow from my desk lamp warmed the surface of the table, illuminating the slow, deliberate work of preserving truth. Once the files were arranged, I paused to synthesize everything into a single line in my notes. The evidence remains continuous, with no missing intervals. I underlined the word continuous once, not for emphasis, but to reflect the unbroken chain the documentation already demonstrated.
The statement felt less like an argument and more like a baseline fact waiting to be recognized. I leaned back slightly, listening to the muted hum of the refrigerator cycling on. The steadiness of that sound mirrored the steadiness of the record I was assembling. Quiet, consistent, free of theatrics. It grounded me in a way no confrontation could. I drafted a brief email, requesting confirmation of the archive location and the name of the custodian currently responsible for the notarial records. Please confirm archive location and custodian, I wrote, letting the sentence stand without embellishment. Precision made the message stronger than any attempt at persuasion. Before sending it, I reviewed the attachments twice, adjusting file order and renaming one document to maintain the sequential pattern. The cursor blinked in patient rhythm while I checked everything one more time. The room felt still but not empty, more like a workspace that understood its role. When I clicked send, the whoosh of the email leaving my outbox felt definitive but calm. Afterward, I allowed myself a single moment of quiet, placing the pen I'd been using parallel to the ledger. Clutter, even minor, could blur thought. Order made the situation manageable. I wrote a short note at the bottom of the page. Truth doesn't require performance. The sentence wasn't meant for anyone else. It simply kept me oriented. Emotion tried occasionally to surface, but I kept it at the edges, where it could inform without distorting. The night air drifted through a partially open window, bringing in the dry scent of cool pavement. I let the breeze wash across my shoulders, steadying whatever tension remained. Before shutting everything down, I calculated checksums for the major files and saved them to an external drive. The process was technical but simple, a way of ensuring no tampering could be claimed later. The drive clicked once as it accepted the data. I listed each checksum beside its file name,
completing a small but essential layer of protection. Then I backed up the folder to a second device, redundancy layered over redundancy. The faint glow of the screen cast soft reflections on the glass cabinet nearby, turning the room into a subdued grid of light and shadow. Even the silence had structure. With the digital records secured and the physical documents returned to their envelope, I prepared for the next step: mediation. The confirmation email for the appointment sat in my inbox, marked unread, only to remind me it still lay ahead. I closed the ledger carefully, feeling the subtle shift in weight as the cover met the pages. There was no anxiety, just readiness. Every piece was where it needed to be. I turned off the lamp and let darkness settle over the table. The kind of darkness that doesn't erase the work, but simply pauses it. Then I stepped away, carrying the calm with me. The mediation room felt smaller than the conference room from earlier that week. Its walls painted a muted beige meant to calm, but achieving only neutrality. A rectangular table sat in the center, polished enough to reflect the overhead lights. My brother arrived with a stack of papers he handled too tightly, the edges bending under his grip. His attorney placed a thin folder before him, the same incomplete scan they'd shown earlier. When they slid it across the table toward the mediator, its pages seemed even more flimsy than before. I opened my laptop, cued the original documents, and waited. My breathing stayed steady, measured. The mediator introduced herself and asked for the first presentation of evidence. The air felt weighted, not hostile, just thick with the residue of things unspoken. My brother's attorney began by presenting the grainy copy, insisting it raised substantial questions. The mediator studied it, her brows tightening as she angled the page under the light. "The witness signature is missing here," she said, tapping the bottom corner. "Is the original available?" The attorney cleared her throat, sidestepping. I slid forward my own copy. Clean, complete, authenticated. The mediator compared them in silence, her gaze moving between each line of text with careful precision. My brother shifted in his chair, his breathing too quick for the quiet room. I recorded the time in my notes, documenting the discrepancy. "Let's address the seal numbering," the mediator said. My brother started to protest, but I spoke first, keeping my tone calm. "Please look at the sequential stamp here," I said, rotating my screen toward her. The embossed imprint caught the light in a way the copy never could. The mediator nodded, acknowledging what was evident. My brother's jaw tightened, and he muttered, "She's always trying to win." I met his eyes briefly. "This isn't about winning," I said quietly. The mediator raised her hand to pause the back and forth. "Please focus on the documents," she reminded us. The room exhaled a collective silence. For a moment, emotion stirred, faint but recognizable, when I remembered how reliable he used to be. A shadow of that older version of him flickered across his expression, then disappeared behind frustration. I kept my posture still, resisting the pull of old memories. The mediator resumed, noting aloud that the copy they'd provided lacked essential components and therefore couldn't be considered reliable evidence. Precision did the work that emotion never could. My hands stayed folded, grounded by the smooth edge of my notebook. I studied my breath, refusing to let the ache in my chest disrupt the order of the process. The mediator requested that both parties submit handwriting samples for a third-party verification. My brother's attorney hesitated, then nodded. I agreed immediately, signing my name beneath the required statement and photographing the timestamp. The pen glided cleanly across the paper, each stroke controlled and deliberate. I watched the mediator collect the forms, placing them into separate envelopes with practiced hands. The room smelled faintly of the carpet cleaner used earlier that morning, a sterile scent that matched the procedural nature of what we were doing. Even the quiet held structure, as if the room knew how to contain conflict without amplifying it. When the session concluded, there was no handshake, no closure, only the soft sound of laptops closing and chairs sliding back. My brother stared at the table for a beat before standing. "Fine," he said, the word flat and brittle. I gathered my notes, logged the meeting's end time, and powered down my device. No one spoke as we filed out into the hallway. The shift felt like an adjustment of focus rather than a resolution, a small recalibration that nudged the truth into clearer view. The corridor lights hummed overhead,
a steady pulse marking the end of another step forward. I walked out of the building with the same calm I brought in. Everything remained intact. The signature sample appointment took place in a quiet room, tucked behind the records department, far smaller than any courtroom, but more exacting in its purpose. A long metal table ran down the center, its surface cool and unadorned. The examiner handed me a form and instructed me to write my grandmother's full name exactly as I remembered seeing it. My hand trembled for a moment, just a single betraying hesitation, before falling into a steadier rhythm. I drew each letter carefully, letting memory guide the curve of the initials I'd watched her sign countless times on birthday cards, tax forms, and donations she never announced. When I finished, the examiner sealed the page in an envelope, pressing adhesive with a firm, practiced stroke. The room smelled faintly of toner and something metallic, like cool coins left in a drawer. I exhaled slowly, letting my pulse settle. My brother arrived with his attorney, carrying a separate envelope of samples collected earlier. They avoided eye contact,
standing rigidly near the door while the examiner prepared the verification materials. 2 independent experts had been assigned, one through the court, the other chosen by my brother's legal team. Parallel reports reduce disputes, the examiner explained, though the reasoning needed no elaboration. My brother tapped his foot, the restless rhythm betraying a tension he tried to hide. I watched the envelopes being labeled, documented, and logged, each step precise, each note written with the gravity of a record meant to outlast arguments. The fluorescent lights hummed quietly overhead, a cold white reminder that truth often arrives without warmth. Once the paperwork was complete, the examiner asked if either party had questions. My brother spoke first. "We'll accept the results, whatever they are." His tone sounded rehearsed, brittle at the edges. I nodded once. "So will I said, keeping my voice level. The examiner marked something on his clipboard, the scratch of pen against paper unusually loud in the otherwise still room. For a moment, everything felt suspended, the kind of pause that holds its breath before a shift. I rested my hands on the table, grounding myself in the cool surface beneath my palms. I could feel the shape of the moment settling. Not dramatic, simply inevitable. A quiet resolve steadied me as the examiner collected the last of the forms. If the analysis somehow contradicted what I knew, I would still honor it. My grandmother's handwriting had always been unmistakable to me. But truth didn't belong to memory alone. It belonged to verification. I felt a strange calm in that acceptance. My brother, on the other hand, seemed restless, shifting his weight from foot to foot. The examiner slid the envelopes into a secure case, locking it with a soft metallic click. The sound reverberated lightly against the narrow room, anchoring the moment with finality. The examiner began scanning our submitted identification documents, the machine emitting a sequence of low, mechanical hums. A sterile brightness washed across the table each time the scanner light passed. The scent of printer paper and fresh ink filled the air, clean, faint, procedural. I watched the examiner align each page with exacting care, ensuring no corner bent, no line distorted. The process carried the quiet reassurance of routine, the kind that doesn't seek validation because it already knows its importance. I breathed evenly, letting my shoulders drop as the work unfolded in meticulous sequence. Order had always been its own form of comfort. When the examiner finished, he closed the file with a firm, deliberate motion. "You'll be notified when both reports are ready," he said, his tone neutral, almost gentle in the way institutional voices sometimes are. My brother gave a terse nod and walked out first, his footsteps echoing down the hallway in uneven beats. I stayed a moment longer, gathering my notes and logging the time.
As I stepped into the corridor, the building's quiet wrapped around me. Cool air, steady fluorescent hum, polished tile underfoot. Nothing dramatic had occurred, yet something had undeniably shifted. The next phase was already waiting. The days that followed carried a kind of suspended calm, the kind that doesn't promise peace but offers a temporary stillness. With the analysis underway, there was nothing to argue, nothing to respond to, nothing to prepare except myself. I kept my routine simple. Morning tea, a short walk around the cul-de-sac, a few minutes watering the potted rosemary my grandmother once tended. Each task grounded me more than it distracted me. In the afternoons, I reread some of her old letters, the ones written in her small, deliberate hand. Her words had a steadiness that softened the tension in my shoulders. The world outside my windows moved slowly, as if mirroring the waiting. I folded her letters carefully each time, placing them back in their envelopes as though returning them to their proper breath. I chose not to call or text anyone involved, not my brother, not his attorney. Everything remained in email, where tone couldn't be twisted into accusation or intent. There was discipline in that decision, a kind of quiet boundary that held both sides in place. My inbox stayed mostly untouched, except for automated updates from the clerk's office and a confirmation that the experts had received all necessary materials. I archived each message with the same methodical attention I'd given all the others. The house stayed calm, its silence unbroken, except for the occasional sound of a car passing or the slow settling of the wooden floors. It was a stillness I needed, even if I didn't fully trust it. With the waiting came reflection, not over the case itself, but over the way truth worked in families. Winning or losing felt irrelevant compared to preserving the integrity of her name. I wrote that sentence in my notebook one evening. The goal is not victory. The goal is accuracy. Seeing it in ink made the intention feel more tangible. I closed the notebook and let my hands rest against the cool surface of the table. Sunlight filtered through the window blinds in thin, ordered lines, tracing the grain of the wood. There was comfort in structure, in the idea that something as complicated as grief could still find a quiet place to settle. Most evenings I walked the neighborhood loop, letting the dry autumn air clear my mind. Pine needles scattered across the sidewalk in uneven drifts, their scent faint but grounding. I listened to the soft rustle of branches overhead and the distant bark of a dog somewhere behind a fence. My steps fell into an easy cadence, steady enough to let thoughts drift but not linger. Occasionally a memory of my brother as a boy surfaced, both of us racing bikes down the same street without any idea of what adulthood would demand of us. The contrast stung, but gently, like an old bruise, touched without pressure. I let the remembrance pass without tightening my chest around it. At home I noticed the porch light flicker once in the evening breeze, then steady itself again. A stray cat wandered across the steps, pausing to glance at me through the screen door, before slipping back into the shadows. Small, ordinary moments had become markers of time, each one quietly reminding me that the world continued while the case waited. I made tea most nights, holding the warm mug between my palms and letting the steam soften the dry air inside the house. The calm wasn't perfect, it had an edge, but it held long enough for me to breathe. On my desk I kept an empty manila envelope labeled court submission, ready for the moment the results would come in. I signed my name on a blank sheet once or twice in the evenings, practicing the steadiness I would need when filing the final paperwork. It wasn't superstition, just preparation. A small rehearsal for whatever verdict the evidence would deliver. I slid the blank form back into the envelope and closed it gently. Another day of waiting completed itself without incident. The silence didn't answer anything, but it didn't demand anything either. It simply held me in place until the next step arrived. The results arrived on a morning that looked ordinary enough to disguise what it carried. A small padded envelope lay against my front door, sunlight warming half its surface while the other half remained in shade. I brought it inside and set it on the dining table, letting the quiet of the house settle around it before opening the seal. When I finally slit the top, the air inside escaped in a soft exhale, releasing the faint scent of paper stored in a cool office. The report rested neatly inside. Original signature confirmed as valid. The words were printed in a crisp serif font, unbothered by emotion. My pulse slowed, not from surprise, but from the confirmation of what I had trusted all along. The morning light widened across the table, illuminating each line with calm finality. Once I'd read the conclusion twice, I folded the report back into its sleeve and prepared the documents for filing with the court. There was no reason for negotiation now, no need for further debate. Truth had its own structure, and it was holding. I opened my laptop and drafted a short message to the clerk. Please proceed with court submission. The cursor blinked at the end of the sentence, steady and quiet. I attached the report, checked each page for clarity, and pressed send. The email chimed out of my outbox, carrying months of careful documentation with it. The kitchen felt still, as though the room itself understood that something long suspended had settled into place. My phone buzzed with a quick acknowledgement from the clerk. Received. Will process today. I responded with a simple thank you and closed the screen. The house returned to its soft morning rhythm. The hum of the fridge, the gentle tick of the analog clock above the window, the faint bark of a dog 2 houses down. I gathered the printed copies of the report, aligning their edges before sliding them into the manila folder I'd prepared earlier. The paper felt cool between my fingers, its weight slight but decisive. As I moved around the room, the floor creaked lightly beneath my steps, grounding me in the ordinariness of the moment. The folder lay open on the table for a moment as I reviewed the sequence of documents. Witness statements, receipts, confirmation letters. Each piece formed a chain that now closed cleanly with the analysis report. I felt a quiet shift inside me. Not triumphant, not relieved, just aligned. The truth fit. My grandmother's handwriting, steady and unmistakable, had never needed defense, only verification. I closed the folder gently, pressing the cover down with a steady palm. My breath came out slow, settling into the same even cadence I'd maintained through every step of this process. Through the window, sunlight reflected off a parked car, splitting into neat, geometric patterns on the wall. Before heading to the courthouse, I printed 2 additional sets, one for my own archive, one as backup. The printer emitted slow, consistent sounds, feeding out each sheet with unhurried precision. The scent of warm paper filled the room. I checked the alignment of the text, making sure no lines were faint or skewed. Accuracy mattered not just for the record, but for the quiet promise I'd made to myself, to handle this process with the same care she would have. I slid the documents into separate folders, labeling them clearly. The organization felt less like preparation and more like closure taking shape in physical form. When everything was ready, I placed the primary folder into my bag, ensuring it lay flat and protected. The house was silent as I reached for the door, but the calm didn't feel empty. It felt earned. I paused for a brief moment, letting my eyes rest on the table where the documents had been spread so many times before. The room held its usual stillness, but now it carried a small echo of completion. I stepped outside and locked the door behind me, the click of the deadbolt clear and firm. The path ahead was straightforward now, procedural, clean, inevitable. He showed up unannounced, the way people do when they're carrying something heavier than they planned to. I heard his car before I saw him, the engine cutting abruptly as if he'd changed his mind halfway up the driveway. When I opened the door, the smell of exhaust still clung to his jacket. He didn't wait to be invited in, just stepped past me and stood in the living room, arms crossed tightly over his chest. "So you won," he said, his voice sharp but hollow. I set the cup of tea I'd been carrying onto the side table.
allowing the steam to rise between us like a boundary.
"If this is winning," I replied, "I don't feel it." The room settled into an uneasy quiet, the kind that absorbs tension without dispersing it. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing once before dropping heavily into the nearest chair. "You made this bigger than it had to be," he muttered, staring at the floor. I leaned against the doorframe, keeping distance that felt both polite and necessary. "I followed the process," I said softly, not as an accusation, but as a simple accounting of fact. The clock on the wall ticked in slow, deliberate beats, filling the silence between us. Outside, a passing bus sent a faint tremor through the window glass. My brother rubbed his temples, breathing unevenly, as if trying to steady a storm that refused to settle. His frustration sat between us like a misplaced piece of furniture. Neither of us knew how to move. "I just wanted it fair," he said finally, though the tone betrayed how far from fairness his attempts had drifted. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I watched the way the light from the window fell across his face, softening edges tightened by months of strain. "Fairness," I said slowly, "doesn't need shortcuts." His eyes flicked up at me, defensive, then tired, then something almost like recognition. The air carried the faint scent of the tea cooling on the table, its warmth fading with each second of hesitation. My brother looked away again, knuckles whitening as he gripped the arm of the chair. Words didn't come easily to him now. They rarely do when the truth has already been laid out. Part of me ached, not from anger, but from remembering how uncomplicated things once were. There had been a time when he trusted me without calculation, when decisions like this wouldn't have split the ground beneath us. That memory brushed against the moment with a soft, unwelcome tenderness. I pushed it aside, gently. "This isn't about taking anything from you," I said. "It's about protecting what she left behind." He shifted, uncomfortable, but listening. The house seemed to breathe with us, the wooden walls absorbing our pauses, the floor creaking faintly as the temperature shifted. I held my stance, grounded but open. We were on opposite sides of something neither of us wanted, but both had shaped. He sighed, long and uneven, then reached into his jacket pocket. A folded slip of paper fell out as he pulled his hand back. An old loan notice, creased and worn. It fluttered to the floor between us. He didn't pick it up. I didn't either. For a moment, the silence felt heavy enough to bend the air. "Things got complicated," he said, the words barely above a whisper. It wasn't an explanation, not really, but it was the closest he'd come to honesty in months. The light in the room softened as a cloud drifted past the sun, leaving us in a muted glow that made everything feel quieter, more fragile. He stood abruptly, as if staying seated would have forced him into truths he wasn't ready to speak. "I should go," he said, not looking at me. I nodded once, giving him space to leave without asking for anything more than he could give. He walked toward the door, his steps uneven, and paused only long enough to say, "I know she loved you." Then he was gone. The house settled again, returning to its familiar stillness. I didn't touch the slip of paper he'd dropped. It remained where it landed, a small, silent testament to everything he hadn't said. Second, the courtroom was smaller than I remembered from my last visit, its wood panels darker, its silence deeper. As if the room itself understood it held the final weight of a long argument. I took my seat at the designated table, placing the folder neatly in front of me. The judge entered with a measured pace, his robe shifting softly with each step. When he asked for confirmation of my identity and role, I responded with short, precise answers. No narrative, no elaboration. He reviewed the documents I had submitted, flipping through them with a steady rhythm that felt almost clinical. My breathing matched the cadence without effort. Across the aisle, My brother kept his eyes lowered, his attorney whispering something he barely seemed to hear. The stillness had a gravity of its own, more powerful than any confrontation that came before it. The opposing attorney presented their argument, but without the missing pieces they had relied on earlier, the statement felt hollow, like a structure built without proper beams. The judge examined the submitted copy, his brows drawing together as he traced the empty witness line and inconsistent seal impression. "This version is incomplete," he said, his tone neutral but final. He turned to the verified records, spending more time on the signature page than anything else. Even from where I sat, I could see the difference. The clarity of the embossment, the consistent numbering, the clean alignment of the notary's stamp. It didn't need my defense. It stood on its own. My brother shifted in his seat, a small movement that spoke volumes. When the judge asked if we had additional comments, I kept my voice even. All documents were obtained through official channels. Chain of custody is intact. That was all. No sentiment attached, no interpretation layered over the facts. The courtroom's faint overhead buzz seemed louder in the pause that followed, filling the space where emotion might have tried to intrude. My brother's attorney attempted to raise concerns about the timing of certain filings, but the judge countered each point with the same steady authority, working through the record like someone following a map he already knew by heart. I folded my hands in my lap, grounding myself in the cool smoothness of the polished bench beneath me. The judge delivered his ruling without preamble. "The will stands as valid." His voice was calm, almost gentle in its firmness. There was no dramatic reveal, just the straightforward recognition of what had always been true. For a moment, I didn't feel relief so much as alignment, like something that had been slightly off angle had finally clicked into place. I glanced at my brother. His shoulders sagged, not in defeat but in a quiet exhaustion I understood more than I wished I did. The clerk recorded the judgment with a soft series of keystrokes, punctuating the moment with a rhythm steady enough to steady me in return. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, striking the dust in the air and creating thin, translucent trails that drifted slowly downward. The judge signed the order, the pen gliding in a smooth arc that left a precise line of ink behind. I watched the movement, not because I needed the confirmation, but because it felt like witnessing the final step in a long, deliberate sequence. The smell of old varnish mixed with the faint scent of paper warmed by the sun. Everything in the room seemed suspended, as if acknowledging the shift before settling back into its usual rhythm. When the hearing concluded, the judge closed the file with a quiet motion. The sound carried farther than expected, landing softly in the still air. I rose, gathering my documents with the same care I'd given them every step of the way. My brother stood too, but neither of us spoke. The moment didn't ask for words. It asked only for acknowledgement. I walked out of the courtroom with steady steps, feeling neither triumph nor sorrow, just the clean clarity of something resolved. The hallway outside was silent except for the muted hum of overhead lights. I held on to the calm as I headed toward the exit. The administrative steps that followed felt almost anticlimactic compared to the long uphill climb that had preceded them. I sat at my kitchen table with the court decree open beside me, drafting short notices to the relevant offices. Each message was concise. Confirmation of ruling, request for record updates, attached documentation. The laptop's keyboard clicked in a steady rhythm, a practical counterpoint to the emotional weight the case once carried. As the emails left my outbox, I felt the house settle into its familiar quiet, the refrigerator humming, the branches outside brushing lightly against the siding. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I simply felt the slow, deliberate return of order. The case had spoken for itself. Now the rest was maintenance. At the clerk's office later that day, I paid the administrative fee for updating the estate file. The clerk handed me a printed confirmation, the ink still faintly warm. I checked the timestamp. noted it in my ledger, and scanned the document before placing it into the folder. The carpeted hallway outside absorbed the sound of footsteps, creating a muted corridor where even small actions felt amplified. I passed a man holding a stack of tax forms, a woman filling out a name change request, and a teenager waiting nervously with a traffic citation. Lives intersecting briefly in an administrative landscape. It reminded me that this process, however personal, was part of something much larger, a routine that outlived every conflict. Back home, I forwarded the decree to the financial institutions that required formal notice. "Please see attached decree," I wrote in each message, repeating the same clear structure. I printed copies, organizing them in small stacks before placing them into clearly labeled envelopes. Each action had its own quiet rhythm. The printer whirred steadily, producing clean lines and sharp text. Sunlight filtered through the blinds in thin bands, landing in angled patterns across the kitchen table. I stood for a moment, breathing in the scent of warm paper and old wood. There was no rush. Accuracy mattered more than speed, and for the first time in a long time, accuracy felt simple. When the final email was sent, I sat back and allowed the quiet to expand. It wasn't the hollow kind that comes after conflict. It was the spacious kind that follows completion. I felt something uncoil in my chest, an absence where tension had lived for months. It wasn't relief so much as emptiness that made room for breath. I closed my eyes briefly, letting the moment stretch. The house felt larger, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. I made a note in my ledger. Post-ruling administration completed. The sentence looked small on the page, but its significance rippled softly beneath it. Outside, clouds began to gather, carrying the scent of imminent rain. I stepped onto the porch, listening to the distant rumble that vibrated softly through the air. The wooden swing creaked as a gust of wind pushed it gently. The scent of wet soil rose early, earthy and grounding. I let the cool air brush my face, easing the warmth of the long afternoon inside. Standing there, I felt connected to nothing and everything, like the world had resumed its natural pace and I was finally moving with it rather than against it. There was peace in the monotony of weather patterns, in the unremarkable return of an ordinary day. Later that night, I placed the updated documents into the safe, pausing for a moment before closing the door. The folder didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt settled. I locked the safe gently, the mechanism clicking into place with measured finality. Then I turned off the overhead lights, leaving only the soft glow of the lamp near the window. The house held its quiet, not brittle or uncertain, but calm in a way that didn't ask for anything. I stood in the doorway for a moment, absorbing the stillness before heading to bed. Something was ending, and something else, though quieter, was beginning. At the land records office, the air held a faint scent of ink and recently handled documents, as if the building absorbed the friction of signatures passing through it. I took a seat at the counter and began filling out the property ownership forms, tracing each line slowly to avoid any error that could create later delays. The clerk on duty, a quiet man with rectangular glasses, slid additional pages toward me. Certification requests, notarized copies, fee statements. The stack grew, but not in a way that felt overwhelming. It was simply procedural, the natural aftermath of a ruling. I double-checked the spelling of my name, ensuring every character matched the decree exactly. Outside the window, a tree cast shifting shadows across the tiled floor, moving in sync with the breeze. Once the forms were complete, I photographed each page before handing them over. My phone captured the texture of the paper, the subtle indentations where signatures pressed into the fibers. The clerk took the stack and moved to the copier behind his counter, aligning each page with a precision that mirrored my own. The machine hummed through its cycle, producing crisp duplicates that slid into the output tray in warm sheets. I uploaded the digital copies to my archive folder,
noting the time and locating each file in its proper sequence. There was a rhythm to it, patient, methodical, unhurried. When the clerk returned, he stamped the first page with a firm motion, the imprint dark and unmistakable. "Initial here and here," he instructed, pointing with a capped pen. I followed his guidance, adding my initials to the margins where necessary. The stamp left a faint scent of fresh ink, sharp and slightly metallic. He handed back a packet of newly certified documents, each one bearing the same clean red seal. "You'll need these for your records," he said. I thanked him and placed them carefully into my folder. The weight of the papers felt balanced, nothing excessive, nothing delicate, just the tangible outline of a process nearing completion. As I stepped into the hallway, the brightness of the building's overhead lights reflected off the polished floor,
creating a pale sheen that followed my footsteps. I paused on a bench near the window to review the digital uploads once more. Everything was clear. No smudges, no missing lines, no crooked scans. The precision offered a kind of quiet satisfaction, the sense that each step had landed cleanly where it was meant to. I wrote a brief log entry in my notebook, summarizing the update in neutral, factual language. Accuracy had become a form of care. Care for the record, care for her intention, care for the truth she deserved. Outside, the afternoon light had shifted into a softer tone, brushing against the courthouse lawn and leaving the grass a muted gold. I walked slowly toward my car, letting the cool air settle across my shoulders. The papers inside the folder rustled slightly as I placed them on the passenger seat, the sound small but grounding. Cars passed at a steady pace, tires whispering across the pavement. Nothing felt rushed anymore. The urgency that once pressed at the edges of each decision had dissolved into procedural clarity. I sat for a moment before turning the key, aware of how the simplest movements, closing a door, adjusting a seatbelt, felt lighter now. When I arrived home, I set the packet on the dining table and opened it one more time. Each document bore the marks of completion, signatures aligned, seals placed cleanly, dates correct. I filed them in the cabinet beside the earlier records, sliding the folder into its designated slot until it met the back panel with a soft, certain stop. The house held its late afternoon quiet, the kind that doesn't demand attention but invites a steady breath. I closed the cabinet gently and let my hand rest for a moment on its smooth wooden surface. The long administrative trail was nearly done. Only a few steps remained. Before moving on to the final filings, I called the archives office to verify that all preservation fees had been processed correctly. The representative on the line spoke in a calm, practiced cadence, confirming each payment and logging number with a professionalism that mirrored the tone I'd grown accustomed to carrying. As she read the details, I wrote them into my ledger, leaving a small margin for cross-referencing later. The room around me stayed still, morning light reaching across the table in a long, deliberate stretch. I repeated each number back to her, making sure nothing slipped through the cracks. When we finished, she thanked me for my thoroughness. Her voice held the soft warmth of someone who noticed order and appreciated it. After the call ended, I remained seated for a moment, letting the quiet settle. Through the window, the porch light flickered once, an old wiring quirk I'd meant to fix but had grown strangely used to. The brief pulse of brightness vanished just as quickly, leaving the room in its natural balance of daylight and shadow. I looked out toward the yard, noticing how the branches swayed in a slow, almost thoughtful rhythm. The moment reminded me that progress didn't always look like movement. Sometimes it was the calm that followed a difficult stretch, the silence that confirmed nothing more needed to be forced. I dialed the records clerk next,
confirming that my grandmother's file reflected all recent updates. "Your case is complete on our end," she said, her tone both efficient and faintly reassuring. I thanked her and took a slow breath before ending the call. These confirmations, small, procedural, formed the final stitches of a process that had once felt frayed and fragile. I updated my digital notes with each detail, saving a backup in the cloud and a second copy on an external drive. The act of recording carried its own quiet dignity, a way of honoring the work and the woman at the center of it. When I sent a brief email of appreciation to the clerk's office, it wasn't out of courtesy alone. Gratitude, when honestly given, created its own kind of order. I wrote a concise message. "Thank you for your assistance throughout this process," and copied my attorney for transparency. The cursor blinked once before the message sent itself into the digital current. I sat back in my chair, my spine easing into the cushion, as if acknowledging the accumulated weight I'd been carrying without complaint. The house felt gentle, almost softened, its edges no longer holding the tension they once absorbed. I closed the laptop and let my hands rest on the table, feeling the coolness of the wood against my palms. For the first time in weeks, the silence didn't feel watchful. It simply existed. A faint draft moved through the room, brushing against my ankles and carrying with it the subtle scent of the outside air. Dry leaves, distant asphalt, a hint of pine. I inhaled slowly, allowing the room's quiet presence to settle inside me. Nothing urgent remained. The process had narrowed to its final, predictable steps, and with that narrowing came a surprising lightness, as though the structure I'd built, piece by piece, was now holding itself upright. I powered off my devices, closed my ledger, and leaned back until my shoulders met the chair's support. The house made a small creak somewhere near the hallway, a settling sound, not unlike an exhale. I let my eyes drift toward the window, where the afternoon light shifted just enough to catch a line of dust in the air. Everything felt contained, accounted for. I folded my notes and placed them in the folder, then closed it with a gentle press of my hand. The work was nearly finished. All that remained was to walk the last few procedural steps with the same quiet steadiness that had carried me this far. In the days that followed the ruling, the distance within the family widened, in ways both expected and quietly painful. Some cousins stopped replying to group messages altogether, their silence more pointed than anything they could have said aloud. An aunt sent a brief text, 3 clipped sentences that managed to feel like an accusation without naming anything directly. I read it twice, then set my phone face down on the table. The house around me was still, holding none of the tension the message carried. I didn't respond. Not because I lacked words, but because responding would have pulled me into a place where the truth would be reshaped, softened or spun. I had no interest in participating in that. The air carried a faint hint of rain-soaked wood from the night before, grounding me more than any conversation could. To avoid speculation, I sent the family group chat a neutral update containing the court order and a short note. "Here is the ruling. Please review." No commentary, no explanation. Within minutes, a cousin replied, "You really made this a spectacle." I typed a reply, then erased it. I retyped another, erased that one too. Finally, I settled on the only answer that felt honest and clean. I followed the process. The message delivered instantly, its simplicity the only protection I needed. I saved the exchange, slipping it into the archive where clarity lived without apology. Outside, a car passed slowly, its tires whispering along damp pavement. My brother didn't reach out again. Our silence held a shape now. No longer resentment, but something more subdued. Like 2 people standing on opposite shores of a river neither felt ready to cross. A cousin sent me a private message saying she felt bad, but hoped I understood why she couldn't take sides. I thanked her, though the neutrality left a hollow echo. Fairness in families often shrank under pressure, collapsing into convenience. I slipped my phone into a drawer to quiet the stream of partial sympathies. The drawer closed with a muted thud, sealing away both noise and expectation. Despite the distance, I held firm to a quiet steadiness. Loneliness came in small waves, but not the kind that overwhelmed. More like a cool tide brushing the edges of a shoreline. I reminded myself that boundaries, while uncomfortable, were not cruelty. They were clarity. I wrote a note in my ledger, not about evidence this time, but about impact. Some relationships shift under truth. Let them. The words weren't bitter. They were observational, almost clinical. A soft breeze filtered through the open window, carrying the scent of wet leaves. The room felt open, unburdened, as if the air itself refused to hold anyone else's expectations. I spent the evening sorting through my grandmother's bookshelf, dusting each spine with slow, deliberate strokes. The covers bore faint impressions of her hands, creases where she had flipped pages, softening where she had rested books open on her lap. I wiped the shelves gently, letting the familiar scent of old paper rise into the air. The work was soothing, grounding. I could hear the soft patter of leftover rain dripping from the gutter outside, a quiet rhythm that matched the pace of my movements. Each book returned to its place felt like a conversation with her, unspoken but steady. When I finished, I sat on the floor beside the shelves, letting the quiet wrap itself around me. The dim glow from a nearby lamp cast soft shadows along the room, making the space feel smaller, safer. I leaned my head back against the wall and closed my eyes for a moment. The house was calm, holding no judgment, no whispers, no divided loyalties. Just stillness. I breathed it in, slow and full, letting the peace settle where the conflict had once lived. The rift in the family was real, but so was the integrity of what I had upheld. And for now, that balance was enough. The request from my brother's attorney arrived late in the afternoon, its tone surprisingly restrained. They wanted to discuss personal items of sentimental nature, suggesting a final negotiation separate from the legal outcome. I read the email twice, noting what was said and what wasn't. There was no mention of contesting the ruling again, no phrasing designed to provoke, just a quiet appeal for face-saving rearrangements. I sat with it for a few minutes, the slow hum of the refrigerator filling the silence behind me. Personal items had never been the issue. The will itself had been the line I refused to let anyone cross. I opened my ledger and wrote a short note. Non-legal negotiation. Evaluate with care. Then I leaned back, letting the stillness of the room guide my next step. I drafted a concise reply, stating that any distribution of keepsakes would follow the inventory listed in the court-accepted documents. No exceptions, no side agreements. But I also added a line I hadn't expected to write. If he wishes to choose items within his allotted share, I'm open to that. It wasn't generosity. It was respect for the structure already in place. I attached the itemized list and sent the message. Outside, I could hear the distant sound of a lawnmower, its steady drone rising and falling like a background metronome. I saved the email into the archive, then closed the laptop, letting the quiet regain its hold on the room. My brother responded later that evening with a short message. Okay. No accusations, no defensiveness, just a single word that carried the weight of a truce. I felt something shift. Not reconciliation, but a loosening of the long tension that had stretched between us. I printed the email and slipped it into a poly sleeve, letting the plastic settle flat on the table. A cool breeze drifted in through the slightly open window, carrying the scent of cut grass and something faintly sweet from a neighbor's garden. The evening light grew softer, washing the room in muted tones that made everything feel slightly less sharp. To formalize the process, I sent a second email, proposing a neutral location and offering to have a third-party witness present. Not because I expected conflict, but because clarity had guided every step so far. My brother agreed, without argument. His tone remained subdued, almost careful. I recognized the shift, and though part of me wished it had come sooner, I accepted it without adding weight to the moment. I logged the upcoming meeting in my planner, then set the pen down with a soft tap. The air in the room felt lighter, as if the case had finally exhaled after months of holding its breath. When I began preparing the items for transfer, I laid each one on the dining table. Framed photographs, a few pieces of costume jewelry, recipe cards worn soft at the edges. I handled each object gently, not out of sentiment, but out of respect for the person whose life they came from. Some items sparked faint echoes of childhood. Afternoons spent baking, evenings listening to her read while rain tapped against the window. The memories arrived without sting now, softened by time and the structure that had reaffirmed her intentions. I arranged everything neatly, letting the table become a quiet landscape of her legacy. Before I packed the items for the meeting, I snapped a photo of each one for the record, labeling them with simple, objective descriptions. Then I placed them carefully into a box lined with soft cloth, ensuring nothing shifted out of place. When I closed the lid, a sense of completion settled over me. Not triumphant, not sorrowful, simply balanced. The house around me grew still, the kind of stillness that follows a decision well made. I turned off the dining room light and let the soft glow from the hallway guide me forward. The negotiation was nearly done, and beneath the quiet, a wider calm continued to take shape. The morning light was soft when I began sorting through my grandmother's things, soft enough to make the dust floating in the air look almost gentle. I opened the cedar chest she kept at the foot of her bed, the hinges releasing a faint, woody scent that belonged entirely to her.
Inside were a few scarves she favored, a small stack of handwritten notes, and a pair of reading glasses she'd once searched for half the afternoon. I lifted each item with deliberate care, setting aside what needed to be documented for the estate and what could simply be preserved. The room was quiet except for the distant hum of a passing car, the kind of quiet that doesn't echo but settles. I felt no rush. This step required a steadiness that matched the life she had lived. Slow, measured, intentional. I placed the letters she wrote to both me and my brother into a separate envelope, sealing it lightly so they wouldn't scatter. Some were short, reminding us to call her when we could. Others carried pieces of advice she never delivered aloud. I photographed each one, before placing them into the archive, ensuring the ink and paper would outlast whatever time might erode. The sunlight shifted slightly across the carpet, warming my hands as I worked. Sorting these things didn't sting the way I once feared it would. Instead, it felt like completing a promise, caring for what she left behind with the same precision she brought to the world. I paused at a small wooden box tucked behind a stack of folded linens. Inside were trinkets she had collected over the years, a faded brooch, a pressed flower from a long-ago walk, a ticket stub from a community play she insisted was the best performance of the decade. I held the brooch between my fingers, its metal cool and lighter than I remembered. These were the pieces that didn't make it into legal inventories, not because they lacked value, but because they lived in a category beyond measurement. I placed the box gently in the center of the bed, documenting its contents with slow, even breaths. Memories rose and fell as I moved through the room, small, quiet recollections that came without bitterness. I remembered how she'd fold her sweaters with an almost mathematical precision, or how she'd hum when thinking through a recipe. That hum echoed faintly in my mind as I sorted her belongings, not haunting but guiding, like a distant rhythm that kept my steps steady. I paused once, sitting on the edge of the bed as the air shifted with the afternoon breeze. Grief didn't press down, it simply moved around me, unobtrusive and gentle. This wasn't about letting go as much as placing things where they belonged. As I moved into the hallway, the scent of old books drifted out from the small room she once used as her study. I opened the door and let the dim interior reveal itself. Dusty shelves, curled corners of well-worn pages, a half-used notebook lying open as if she'd meant to return to it. I gathered her belongings methodically, separating what would remain in the house from what needed to be shared with my brother during the final exchange. The rhythm of the work stayed slow,
unforced. Each item found its place, whether in a box, an envelope, or a quiet corner where it had always belonged. When the sorting was complete, I placed the estate documents into their designated folder and added a label. Final. The word didn't feel heavy. It felt accurate. I locked the folder in the safe, the door closing with a soft, definitive click. The afternoon light reached across the hallway as I stepped back, casting long shadows that stretched toward the living room. The house felt quieter now. Not emptier, just clearer, as though the air itself had been sifted. I took one last look at the neatly organized boxes and breathed in slowly. The work was done. The memories remained intact. We arranged to meet at a neutral office space near the courthouse, an unremarkable room with beige walls, a rectangular table, and chairs that felt slightly too upright. It suited the purpose, a place meant for clarity, not comfort. I arrived a few minutes early, placing the prepared checklist on the table and reviewing each line with slow, steady focus. Framed photos, kitchen items, a few keepsakes, nothing legally complex, just objects with quiet histories. When my brother walked in, accompanied by his attorney, he gave me a brief nod. No hostility, no warmth, just acknowledgement. The air held a faint scent of carpet cleaner and recycled ventilation, the kind of neutral environment where truth didn't need to defend itself. I opened the meeting by outlining the procedure, one item at a time, each checked against the inventory accepted by the court. My tone stayed calm, grounded in the structure we'd agreed upon. The attorney nodded, taking notes with small, precise motions of the pen. I lifted the first object, our grandmother's small wooden jewelry box, and set it on the table. My brother examined it briefly, then signed the acknowledgement form. I photographed the signature and placed the box into his designated bin. The process unfolded with quiet efficiency, each step recorded, each movement deliberate. It felt less like a negotiation and more like closing a long, steady circuit. As we moved through the list, I noticed my brother's posture shift. No longer tense, no longer defensive, just tired. He asked a few questions about certain items, his voice subdued, almost tentative. When we reached the letters she wrote to both of us, he hesitated. "These were hers," he said softly. "They belonged to both of us." I nodded and suggested copies be made so each could keep a complete set. He agreed without resistance. The copy machine in the corner hummed, warming the room with the faint scent of toner. For a moment, the atmosphere felt less fractured, as if the simple act of sharing something she wrote bridged a small part of the distance between us. We continued, checking off items with patient rhythm. A third-party witness initialed each page, her presence unobtrusive but essential. The structure kept everything clean. No assumptions, no loopholes. When we came to the last item, a small ceramic dish our grandmother had used for spare buttons, my brother paused again. "She kept everything," he murmured. Not a complaint, more an observation tinged with quiet grief. I nodded, placing the dish gently into his bin. The room held a muted stillness, the kind that doesn't rush to fill itself with unnecessary words. Some truths didn't need to be spoken aloud. They simply existed between us. With the physical items accounted for, we reviewed the final paperwork. I slid the last set of forms across the table, and my brother signed with a steadying breath. The witness initialed beside him, then handed the pages back to me for my signature. The pens moved with a soft, consistent scratch against the paper, marking the end of a process that had once felt impossible. I placed the completed forms into a labeled envelope, sealing it with firm pressure. Outside the window, a light drizzle began, streaking the glass in thin, uneven lines. The sound softened the room, turning everything quiet and measured. When the meeting concluded, we gathered our things in silence. My brother lifted the box of items, adjusting the weight in his arms. As he reached the door, he paused, not turning fully, just enough to speak without looking back. "Thank you for doing this the right way." I met his words with a small nod he couldn't see. After he left, I collected the paperwork, ensuring each document was aligned before slipping it into my folder. The room felt empty, but not cold. Emptied, perhaps, in the way a task feels after it has been done completely. I stepped outside into the drizzle, letting the cool air settle across my face. Another step finished, another chapter nearing its close. After the transfer meeting, the house felt unusually quiet, as if it were waiting for me to choose what came next. I sat at the dining table with the final stack of estate documents beside me, their edges all neatly aligned. Among them was a note my grandmother had written years earlier, outlining a small wish she'd hoped the family would honor. A modest donation to a community program she believed in. It wasn't legally binding, just a handwritten hope folded into the back of her notebook. I traced the lines of her script with my fingertip, feeling the quiet weight of her intention. The question wasn't whether I would carry it out, but how quickly I could do it. Some wishes didn't need validation. They needed completion. I drafted a short email to the community director, requesting information about making a contribution in her name. The reply came quickly, warm, grateful, touched. They invited me to attend the next small gathering where they would acknowledge her gift, but I declined the offer gently. "I prefer to stand in the back," I wrote. "This is about her, not me." I sent the donation through an online portal, watching the confirmation message appear with a quiet finality. The act felt simple, steady, less like charity and more like fulfilling a final thread of her legacy. I closed the browser and sat back, letting the moment settle. That weekend, the community read her name aloud during their meeting. I didn't attend, but the director sent a short voice clip. In it, someone described her as a woman who gave without needing to be seen. The words reached me through the small speaker on my phone, clear and undramatic. I listened twice before saving the file. The living room felt still around me, sunlight drifting across the floor in slow, widening shapes. The absence of applause made the recognition feel more honest. Her name stood in a quiet space, exactly the way she lived, without spectacle, without claim. Later, I stepped outside to clear my head. The late afternoon air carried a soft chill, brushing across my arms. Children played somewhere down the street, their laughter rising and falling in uneven bursts. The distant sound blended with the rustle of leaves overhead, forming a quiet soundtrack to the end of a long season in my life. I walked toward the edge of the yard, letting the breeze tug lightly at my sleeves. For the first time in months, I felt the edges of my thoughts loosen, no longer held taut by deadlines, filings, or evidence. Purpose remained, but the urgency had finally dissolved. As evening approached, I sat on the porch steps with a mug of warm tea cupped between my palms. The sky shifted into a muted gradient, soft blue fading into a pale gold that lingered just above the rooftops. The street felt calm, almost slowed, as if holding space for quiet decisions. I thought about everything that had unfolded, the strain, the resolve, the steady steps forward, and found myself breathing easier than I expected. Her legacy was intact, not because of a courtroom ruling, but because the truth she left behind had been honored without deviation. The moment held a gentle clarity, one I didn't rush to define. When the day grew darker, I rose and walked back inside, turning on the porch light almost without thinking. The warm glow spread across the doorway, softening the distance between the world outside and the quiet inside. I closed the door carefully, letting the click settle into the silence behind me. Nothing dramatic remained, just a steady sense of alignment, the kind that comes after doing what needed to be done. I placed the empty mug in the sink and let the room breathe with me. The next steps would come, but for now, calm was enough. The final email from my attorney arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning. Its subject line simple: all records complete. I opened it slowly, letting the words anchor themselves before reading through the attached summary. Every document had been logged, every certification verified, every procedural step closed. There was nothing pending, no loose thread waiting for attention. I downloaded the digital archive she provided, a neatly organized folder containing every piece of correspondence, scan, and filing. The cursor hovered over the files as if inviting me to review them again, but I didn't feel the need. The work was whole. I saved the folder to my external drive and watched the progress bar fill in a calm, uninterrupted sweep. The house around me felt steady, as though it recognized the weight of what had ended. I printed the final record for my physical binder, waiting as the pages emerged warm from the printer. The faint scent of warmed paper rose into the air, blending with the quiet hum of the machine. After hole-punching the sheets, I slid them into the binder behind the earlier documents, aligning them with a practiced precision. When I closed the cover, it felt heavier than it had before, not in burden, but in completion. I placed the binder on the table and paused, letting my hand rest on it for a moment. Outside, a gentle breeze shook the leaves on the nearest tree, creating a soft rustling sound that drifted through the window. To preserve everything, I performed one last check, opening the digital archive, running a final checksum comparison, and confirming the files were identical across all backups. The numbers matched cleanly, each one reflecting the integrity of the record. I documented the verification in my ledger, short, factual, without embellishment. Final archive validated. The line looked smaller than the months behind it, but I felt its significance settle quietly in my chest. I closed the ledger and placed it beside the binder, 2 parallel volumes that held the long path from doubt to clarity. The room stayed still, carrying the soft resonance of closure. The safe in the hallway closet stood open, its interior shelves cleared earlier to make space. I placed the binder inside, positioning it beside the envelope containing the last of the physical originals. The metal door felt cool beneath my fingertips as I pressed it closed. When the locking mechanism clicked into place, the sound held a certainty that resonated deeper than expected. I stepped back, letting the small silence that followed fill the space. The safe was no longer a place of waiting. It had become a resting place, an archive of something earned through patience and steady resolve. Evening light filtered through the living room windows, casting long shadows across the floor. I settled into the chair near the bookshelf, letting the quiet stretch around me. I thought briefly about writing to my brother, but the words hadn't formed yet, and I wasn't interested in forcing them. Instead, I opened a blank document on my laptop and typed a short note. Only a few lines, reflecting on the process. Not for anyone else, just for myself. When I reread it, the tone felt calmer than anything I'd written in months. I saved it under a simple name, then closed the laptop gently. Before going to bed, I wrote him a letter by hand. Steady strokes, no corrections. I didn't send it. I placed it on top of the binder inside the safe, a quiet message waiting for a future moment that might arrive or might not. The night outside was still, punctuated only by the soft chorus of insects. I stood in the doorway for a moment, absorbing the quiet. Something inside me loosened, not breaking, just releasing the last trace of tension I'd been holding. Then I turned off the lights, letting the darkness gather softly around the edges of the room. The work was done. The rest could wait. A few days after everything settled, I woke earlier than usual. The house held a calm I hadn't felt in a long time, the kind that comes when all the tension has finally drained from the walls. I walked through each room slowly, not out of sentiment, but to reacquaint myself with a space no longer defined by paperwork or conflict. Sunlight slipped in through the blinds, landing in soft geometric patterns across the hardwood floor. The quiet felt earned. I paused in the hallway,
noticing how the air held a faint scent of cedar from the closet where the safe rested. Nothing in the house seemed to demand attention anymore. It simply waited, steady and unburdened, ready to become a place for living again, rather than sorting or defending. In the kitchen, I boiled water for tea, listening to the soft rumble grow until it clicked itself off. I poured the water into a mug and watched the steam curl upward, dissolving into the cool morning air. The simplicity of the moment reminded me of the mornings my grandmother used to keep. Quiet, deliberate, never rushed. I sat at the table with the mug warming my hands and glanced at the empty chair across from me. For months, I had imagined arguments there, counter-arguments, next steps, deadlines. But now the chair felt like what it was, a place for someone to sit, nothing more. The world had shifted back to a basic rhythm, one without legal shadows stretching across it. I spent the afternoon organizing the shelves in the living room, not because they needed order, but because the act felt steadying. Each book found its place with quiet precision. A photo frame tilted slightly forward as I moved a stack, and I paused to straighten it. It was a picture of her, standing in the yard, sunlight catching the silver in her hair. The image didn't pull at me the way it once had. It simply existed, whole, unaltered by conflict or the weight of decisions. I dusted the frame with the sleeve of my shirt, then set it gently back on the shelf. The room exhaled with me, as though relieved to reclaim its own calm. Later, I stepped outside and walked to the edge of the driveway. The late afternoon air carried the faint scent of cut grass from a neighbor's yard. I could hear soft conversations, drifting from open windows, and the distant rumble of a garbage truck turning a corner. Nothing was dramatic. Nothing weighted. Ordinary life moved around me with an ease I realized I'd missed. I looked up at the porch light, its soft glow steady now after weeks of flickering. I had replaced the wiring the day before, not as a symbolic gesture, but because the house deserved to be whole again. The small glow felt like a quiet reassurance, stable and warm. Before evening settled fully, I opened the safe once more. The binder rested exactly where I left it, alongside the letter I had written but not sent. I didn't read the pages. I didn't need to. Closure didn't require revisiting. I simply checked that everything was in order, then closed the safe again. The click of the lock was soft, almost gentle. I stood there for a moment, with my hand resting against the cool metal, letting the clarity of the moment settle. I wasn't holding anything together anymore. The process had ended. What remained was choice, how to live forward, not backward. That night I stepped onto the porch with a blanket around my shoulders and watched the street settle into its familiar stillness. Porch lights blinked on one by one up and down the block, forming a quiet constellation of warm yellow glows. I breathed deeply, the cool air easing its way into my lungs with a slow, steady calm. The house behind me was silent but alive, no longer burdened by conflict or the weight of unfinished responsibility. I sat there until the sky darkened completely, letting the quiet fold around me. When I finally rose to go inside, I felt something simple and certain return, a sense of my life realigning, steady and unpressured. The story had ended. What remained was peace. In the end, the house didn't feel heavier or emptier. It just felt honest again. No more documents stacked on the dining table. No more quiet tension humming beneath every phone call. No more wondering if the truth would hold. It had held. Not because I fought loudly, but because I fought steadily. And now, as I walked through each room in the soft evening light, I felt something settle inside me, a calm that belonged not to victory but to closure. The family may never return to what it was, but legacy isn't measured by the harmony that survives. It's measured by the truth we protect when it's threatened. My grandmother's voice didn't echo through the halls, but her presence lived in every corner I had preserved with care. I realized then that this wasn't just the end of a dispute. It was the beginning of living forward instead of backward. If this story reminded you of something in your own life, or if a single moment in it made you pause, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you want more stories told with the same quiet honesty, make sure to subscribe to the channel.